Thank you. Am I good on sound? Good? Okay, great. Well, thank you, Matthew. That was an awesome introduction. I need to have that recorded and repeated. Joanne, thank you as well. Thank you to everybody who's made my visit so wonderful here. I've really enjoyed my last 2 days. I brought some Texas humidity for y'all to work with. But yeah, I've lost a couple pounds. That's the good news. Anyway, it's a great honor to be here. I really do think about sort of, when I got the opportunity to come here and visit, I was like, I would love to come to Vanderbilt and talk to the students and the faculty about my work. And when I was asked what I was going to talk about, I was like, I don't know, I've got a million things to talk about. But I'm really excited about this piece. It's an upcoming piece that's going to be in urban education sometime soon. It's been accepted. But yeah, I just wanted to share this sort of recollection of my research up to this point. I wouldn't say it's a retrospective. I'm too young for that. I am young. But it is definitely a reflection on some of the work I've done up to this point in my career and sort of thinking about what does it mean to be a black scholar in the academy in 2018. And I'll talk more about the reference point I'm making here. So before I get started, I do want to sort of acknowledge the fact that we're actually in a space, the land that was actually stolen from the Cherokee and Chickasaw nations. Also acknowledging the Catawba, Muskogee, Creek, Natchez, and Shawnee, and Yuchi tribes that are indigenous to this area. It's also, we're meeting in Tennessee, home of Andrew Jackson, and I think we have to sort of keep in mind his role in the forced removal and genocide of Native Americans. And that's just something I think we should just sit with for a while and think about. So, inspiration. You probably have heard that phrase, reclaiming my time, before, but if you have not, I'm happy to sort of hip you to what happened from last year. If I can dexterously move this right. Okay.
25 years of service.
Reclaiming my time. Reclaiming my time.
California's Representative Maxine Waters is having a moment.
Reclaiming my time.
It all started on July 27th when Secretary of Treasury Steve Mnuchin was testifying during a House committee meeting and seemingly evading her questions.
Reclaiming my time. Reclaiming my time. Reclaiming my time. Reclaiming my time.
Waters repeatedly invoked House floor procedure, a response quickly going viral.
That's not what brought you here to share. I'm reclaiming my time.
Despite other views to address the sensation.
I'm so surprised about the way the millennials in particular have connected with me.
Waters was joined briefly by Michael Kilgore, the voice behind this gospel remix. If we catch you too, no doubt, sources tell us the Congresswoman will stick to her day job.
So Representative Waters should know that post-millennials or pre-millennials also are allured with this particular presentation. But to me, I thought about the symbolism of an African-American woman in the most powerful legislative body in the country, having her time hijacked, somebody filibustering, and how she was steadfast in fighting and reminding him, this is my time. And it made me think about, as scholars of color, African-American scholars, scholars of color generally, how much of our time is taken by other things, by other people. And so I found it inspirational. I'm not sure that's what she was planning to have this happen, but it has happened. I'll have to send a copy of the paper to her at some point. But let me go back to my early days in graduate school. So I started graduate school in 2001. It's a while ago. But you know when you're in that first year, you're doing a lot of reading, you're just excited about being in grad school, and you're reading everything that comes out, right? Remember those days, right? Okay, so I read this piece, Afro-American Scholars in the University, Roles and Conflicts, by Bill Banks here. It was an 84 piece, it was old literature, but I was like, this is a piece that's talking about black scholars' experiences, you know, when I was in middle school, elementary school, yes. And I was like, wow, you know, this is fascinating. And, you know, he sort of walked through the uses and misuses of black scholars, the constituencies in conflict, the range of responses for black scholars, standards and realities for black scholars, the stigma of affirmative action, and the burden of symbolism. And it's also in a tradition of black urban educating scholars who talk about the tensions that black faculty face. And you can see some of the folks who've written on that issue. And I always said to myself, if you ever become a faculty member, you're going to write a piece about this because you're going to examine this. This is very early in my career. I didn't necessarily think I was going to end up doing this as a job. And lo and behold, when I realized, A, I have tenure, and B, I have some space in my schedule to write, I want to write this piece. And I think just the Maxine Waters piece kind of charged me to talk about how is our time being claimed and how can we reclaim it, right? So this is an important quote, and I'm going to stand behind this because I actually keep on looking this way. I want to look at y'all, so I'm going to stand over here. One thing that Banks talked about is the conflicting role expectations, social isolation, and personal adjustments for young black intellectuals in predominantly white institutions. The fact that they're isolated, they don't get support from the general population. A lot of times it's like, what's wrong with you? Why are you not successful? Why are you not able to do the things you're supposed to be doing? That kind of moving away from the reality and lived experiences of scholars of color. And basically this idea that for black scholars, predominantly white spaces are often inhospitable, right? It's a pretty powerful statement in 1984. My question was, how far have we come in 30-something years? So how did I come to this work? This is really a conceptual piece that's informed by my critical constructivist work on black academics. That's when I started as a dissertation writer in 2006, all the way to pretty much the current day in my work. By my methodological approach, I am a phenomenological interviewer, Irv Seidman's sort of methodology of really examining what are the formative experiences that shape and put us where we are today. So in other words, I'm interested in what's happening right now, but I can only know that by knowing what's happened to you before this point. Like, how did you get here? Scholarly personal narrative is a methodology I've been really embracing recently. Robert Nash and others have written about this. Behar's vulnerable anthropology is another way of looking at this. But the fact that lived experiences of scholars of color is actually a valuable piece as well. I'm often in spaces talking to scholars in other fields. So I'm in education, and generally education people tend to have some space for this, but engineers, physicists, not so much. And I keep on saying to these people, we need chronicles and we need narratives about your experiences as a black physicist, a Latinx English professor. Those kinds of things we need to know. So it's important because when I look for the literature, it tends to be empirical, it tends to be large, it doesn't tend to be specific about experiences. And also, in my career, I've spent some time visiting different campuses, like this one, and invariably I spend time with black scholars. I get to talk to them, we go to lunch, we go get drinks maybe, and we get to get real. You know, we're away from campus, we start talking about what's it like to be in your institution. And I hear some stories. So I'm going to share some of those stories I've heard with you as well as part of this piece. So you probably recognize this as an experience you're probably familiar with, the virtual monopoly of academic and instructional positions by individuals who are white and male, right? Not surprising to anybody. This piece by Menges and Exum is really interesting. In '83, like just the sort of evolution of black scholars in the white academy. Basically that black scholars don't really exist in big numbers at PWIs until the 70s. And even then, they're predominantly at HBCUs, right? And basically, you look at the fact that almost all faculty in 1978 are white, and it's an amazing number. You look at that. So, you know, that was then, this is now, right? Well, let's look at what's now. So, first of all, this graph is cut off because I just could not have the white folks just go off the roof. You can see, if I can point out right here, 81.8, 76.4%, 73.3%, 80.8%. So it's gotten better, but certainly look at what's happening here. So look at this right here. This is professors, full professors. Look at representation for folks of color. Black folks, 3.9%, Latinx folks, 3.5%, Native American folks, 0.1%, Pacific Islander folks, 0.3%. Okay, the highest people in the academic ladder, right? Looking over at associate professors, people like me, some of the work done by Coach indicates to us that the least satisfied faculty out there are actually associate professors. I don't know if that's true or not. But anyway, you can see the numbers shift as well. But this is really interesting to me as well. This right here is faculty with no rank. And this conversation I'm having is mostly about faculty who are tenure track at PWIs. But we have to also talk about the experiences of adjunct faculty and clinical faculty at these institutions who often are ignored in this work, right? You can see the representation is quite high, actually. You actually see an increase of numbers of black folks, Latinx folks, Asian American folks who are actually in the institutions but not ranked, without rank. And without rank, you have less power, right? So that's another thing to think about. So progress. And I've gone to institutions and I've talked to folks and, they're like, Rich, talk to us about faculty diversity. You're an institution that's doing better. And I show them the data. I'm like, it's kind of a sad story, but being better at this is not saying much, right? The PWIs are doing generally a not very good job of recruiting and retaining faculty of color. So let's talk about Amado Padilla, because another piece I read early in my career was this piece he wrote about cultural taxation. And if I have one contribution in the field I've pretty much done, I think, in a good way, is getting this word out, this concept. So you probably heard the term black tax, the term problematic popularity from Geneva Gay, Smith and his colleagues, racial battle fatigue. Y'all heard that stuff? So it's out there, right? But basically there's 6 categories that Padilla talked about how faculty of color are misused and taxed in the academy. So you're an expert in diversity. Because you occupy a racial or ethnic identity, you know about that thing. And some of us do have that kind of expertise, but a lot of us are just like, no, I'm just an ornithologist. I'm not really into that, right? Being called upon to educate the majority group. That is something that every faculty member of color I've ever talked to says is part of their job. I end up doing advising for groups. I end up doing community-based work. I end up doing work with my colleagues. Sometimes it's like formalized, like I actually have a role. And sometimes it's informal, like, you said something crazy. Let me tell you what you did and why it's a problem, right? Of course, all the affirmative action committees, those kinds of things. And of course, that work often doesn't go anywhere. It's a report, right? Nothing changes. Being a liaison between the communities of color and your own identity group, that's pretty common for folks. So, we don't have community contacts with these folks. Can you talk to them for us? And a lot of times you're actually doing that work for the first time. You're actually going into communities that have never had contact with the institution, and you're doing sort of that liaison work. Of course, being the troubleshooter. Okay, the student said I was racist because I did X, Y, and Z. What do you think? And you're involved in those kinds of conversations, right? And finally, for the folks who speak other languages besides English, is actually translating, right, folks, documents, talks, and so forth and so on. And the point about cultural taxation, this is all part of what's wrapped into the job. Nobody will ever tell you, here's a job description, you're teaching this class, and by the way, these 6 things you're also doing, right? But it happens. It's invisible labor. So I wanted to show you a clip from a show I really enjoy called Insecure. And it was funny to me because I was looking at this and I'm like, I know this is being talked about in another context, but this is definitely examples of cultural taxation. So let's let Molly and Issa talk about this a little bit for y'all.
I don't know what that means. I don't know what that shit means. Here she does. Quite adjusting to the culture here. It would be great for you to have a chat with her. It would be much better for you to have a conversation with her and say for anything get lost in translation.
Black Northern slang.
That'll sink a little bit, but I don't know if you caught, the piece that was really important was the piece where Molly is talking to her colleague, and there's a black woman who's in the firm, and she says, can you talk to her about she's not fitting in, which is a code for she's too black for us, basically. And she says, again, flipping reversing, she's like, you know what? Why don't you talk to her and make sure the message is clear? This is the kind of work I'm talking about. In the other case, of course, Issa is being asked about the newest slang term, and she's like, I don't know what that is, but of course she does. How many of y'all have seen this happen in your own experiences? Okay, look around. A lot of folks have had this experience, right, where you've been put on the spot to explain something or taken on extra work of mentoring folks. So I love this, and I love my colleagues, but every so often, I'll have a colleague say to me, Rich, and they'll call me up and they're like, I'm talking to a terrific African-American young man, and I'd love for you to talk to him. And I'm like, probably, but my sort of plate is full, so I can probably talk to him, but is there something besides me being black and male that's connecting us together? Like, for instance, is he interested in education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And sometimes it's like, I just need to have a black person in front of this person. Now, I understand that because for some people in some of the institutions, at my institution, they don't see black people. So a lot of it's just like help, can we get somebody to connect with this person? But it's also, you gotta consider what I'm going through. And we've all had that experience, I'm sure. We sit in front of somebody and we've been told we should connect at some point, and we're like, hi, we have a shared identity. What else? And I will say, for the most part, I enjoy doing that. For the most part, it has been successful, but at the same time, it's kind of funny that sometimes people assume that that work is my work to do. And of course, I want to make sure those students have access to the right kinds of mentorship and networks, but at the same time, I can only do so much, right? Oops. What I have found in my work, though, is cultural taxation. You might say, well, let's get rid of that. Let's just take it out. What I actually have found is that most people want to do the work. I rarely encounter people who say, I do this stuff and it's terrible, and I hate it, and I hate being around students, and I hate mentoring. It's more that the academy does not recognize that work as being valuable. You know, so in other words, promotion, merit, tenure, those kinds of things, we don't talk much about the mentoring work, or we don't value it as equally as the research and the teaching, right? We need better terms besides service. Service is a bad word in my neighborhood, right? Because service is the same thing if you're on a committee that does commencement and you pick the flowers and it's doing the mentoring work. Those aren't the same kinds of things, right? So Nancy Cantner, I was at a meeting one time and she said, you know, we need to start calling this work intramural teaching, right? In other words, we are doing some kind of teaching outside of the traditional classroom context, but that's what it is, right? We need to have the right kind of values given to that kind of work. Also, that we often have the responsibility of repairing the breach, right? Something has happened between the institution and communities, and we're often on the front lines doing that work. So as graduate students, as faculty members, as staff members, how many of you go out and do work in communities where there is rarely a presence from your institution? People are like, what are you doing here, right? You're here from the university? Really? Why? Why is it not rewarded? Because oftentimes you're the only person who's gone in those communities and talked to people about what you do or what the value of the institution is. And all of a sudden they're like, okay, well now a kid in the community is thinking like, I might be able to go to the institution. I see a value beyond athletics, right? I'm from Southeast Austin. If y'all know Austin at all, I'm from Dove Springs, which is a black and brown community. Our college going rate is the lowest in the city of Austin. And when I came to visit my good friend David Kaufman's school, Perez Elementary in Southeast Austin, I went there and it was like career day or something, and you know, they said, this is Dr. Reddick, he's a professor. First of all, it's Dr. Reddick to elementary school kids. They're like, do you fix broken legs? I'm like, not that kind of doctor, another kind of doctor. Walked them through it a little bit, and they were just perplexed. They're like, but you don't play basketball? I'm like, no. You don't play football? No. I teach. And they were just like, they had never seen that, right? They'd never seen this idea. So they were sitting and grappling with this idea that there's a black man in front of me who's not an athlete, but he's university affiliated. You know, tell me more. And granted, they're in second grade through fifth grade, but think about that sort of life-changing experience that they're now negotiating. And I can tell you, as a kid growing up in that same community, my first interaction with the University of Texas was through athletics. Our president, Greg Fenves, says athletics is the front door of the university. He's right. That's how we usually get to know the university. So many students I talk to say, I saw the ad for, you know, this university on TV during football. That's why I went to this institution. I was interested in it, right? But that's such important work. Why are we not rewarding it in some important way? So this idea of multiple expectations from multiple communities and constituents is really important, because one thing that faculty of color do, you're not just serving one community. And of course, in research universities, we're so interested in sort of impressing upon folks in the research community, right? That's not all you're doing. And you know people who just do this, right? You know people whose sole existence is to do that kind of work. They're putting out research, they're getting grants, that's all they're doing, right? Guess what? Virtually all of us in the academy mentor students, partly because we want to, partly because we need to, right? And also this idea of majority students, where do they fit in? A colleague of mine teaches an Introduction to Black Studies course. So it's got a lot of students who are not in the Black Studies major. And many of the students are being exposed to things like white privilege, white fragility, those different kinds of concepts for the first time. And guess what? They're not saying, that's great, thanks for the information. They're arguing, they're like, that's not right, that's not real. And she expends psychic energy in the classrooms trying to make sense of this to students, taking time to talk to students, walk them through the whole situation. Every so often she'll have a student come back to her and say, you know what, thanks, that really helped me. But think about the time she's spending doing that, right? Because you're not just sort of putting forth materials. This is really important. I did a piece not too long ago about cultural diversity educators and sort of the fatigue and trauma they experience, because we're not talking about fire codes or theorems in physics. We are talking about things that impact our communities directly. And it's painful sometimes, especially when people say, you just said a bunch of stuff, I don't believe any of it. You know, prove me wrong. You know, that kind of experience is a lot what folks deal with. This cultural moment also requires a lot from scholars of color. The Trump, Sessions, DeVos era has afforded us plenty of opportunities to sort of talk about how is this impacting our communities. You know, not just an academy, but, you know, students in schools, folks who are dealing with police brutality, different things like that. It's happening at a breakneck pace, and quite frankly, a lot of times we're called upon it. I get called upon all the time to answer questions or address issues that I'm not necessarily in the midst of. The BBC asked me to talk about the Childish Gambino video. I'm like, that's not really my thing. But I get it, right? Because this is part of what I take on as a black person in the academy, is that when things happen that are relevant to black people, I'm often asked what I think about that. And I don't mind telling my opinion. I don't mind it at all. But it's also work we do. Back to epistemology, right? The idea of objectivity. Academic spaces are so obsessed with this concept of objectivity. Is the work stand on its own? Is it objectively, quote unquote, good? And the reality is, we are often in spaces where we're fighting with things like emotion. So when I'm talking about things like cultural taxation or white fragility, I'm not just talking in the abstract. These are things that impact my life, my children's lives, my community's lives. So it's not something I can just talk about dispassionately. I have to sort of, and of course, let me be slightly loud or slightly animated, and guess what I am? I'm the angry black man, or the angry brown person. You know how it works. This is what's going to happen to us. Also, what counts as scholarship? You know, this is my question for the academy. Are we woke enough to realize that it's not just going to be found in the covers of a journal that's paywalled or in a book that's in the library? So many folks, especially black women, are on Twitter, you know, dropping knowledge, cite a sister. There's different places you can go and just learn so much stuff. What's the value of that? And I've heard my colleagues say, well, it's nice to engage in social media. It's nice. But we also know there's a dark side to this as well, right? I'm going to talk a little bit later on about some folks that I know who have had their careers impacted by media and social media generally. But we know a tweet that's put out in haste or that's put out of anger can be captured, right? And then all of a sudden, you've got other problems to deal with. We'll talk about it a little bit later on. Issues of community engagement. I think many of us, especially in the field like education or social work or sociology, we're kind of in those fields where we're often doing work in communities, both proximal to the campus, but also distant, but nevertheless doing community engaged scholarship. A lot of times people in the community question what we're doing there, right? Oh, you're from the university, so you're gonna come and look at us and talk about how bad we are, right? And that's actually a legitimate feeling, right? For a long time, you know, universities have come into spaces and critiqued them, talk about their flaws and shortcomings, right? Never mind about what your implicated responsibility is in that whole process, right? Issues of redlining and gentrification. Universities are often involved in that process, but often don't talk about their responsibility in that whole process. As emerging scholars, I always say to people, you need to find advocates in the community who can talk for your work. And it's amazing to me because I made some connections in my early days. And again, being a person doing community work in a town I grew up in is actually quite nice because I know people who are the brokers and the power players. And I know people whose voices carry weight institutionally. And it's kind of nice when you know somebody who's got the president's ear is saying, you know, Rich came to our meeting the other day and it was really impactful. It was really positive. We don't often think about that. We are sometimes so sort of obsessed with trying to impress people on this space and not thinking about the impact we have with people outside this space who talk to people in this space, right? Also, the idea of finding the right kind of outlets to get your work out there. I've had many conversations, and I think what I've come to realize, I have to make sure I do things at a research university that gets me published in nice journals that have paywalls and all those different kinds of things. But what really gets me going is when I talk to a professor in a community college who says, we assign your reading to our freshman students. That's why I do what I do. And I know I have to do other things. It's kind of, you kind of find the best way you can do things. But at the same time, I've always thought about, okay, let me write that piece that's researchy and really nice and it's got lots of citation. Let me write the piece that's actually going to be read by people who work in the field. That's another important piece I do. And then sometimes it's not writing, it's actually going and talking about it. Because people are like, I ain't going to read that. Can you talk to us for 20 minutes about that? Sure, I can do that for you. And of course, even using social media as well. I've learned to do that as well. Like, here's what's happening. I was at the State of the University address a few days ago, and the director of communications at UT was like saying, hey, this is a great speech by the president, but if you want to know what happened, look at Rich Reddick's Twitter feed, because he was talking about it the entire time. Because I know people are following me who are not there, who don't understand what a provost does, but they're like, university's doing what exactly? And this impacts me how? And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to be that person who's contributing to a community by talking to people who are outside of my space. Frankly, I get tired of talking to academics. Not today. But sometimes it's like, enough already. Let me talk to some people who do other things, right? Standards and realities. This is another challenge for black faculty, I think, and faculty of color generally. I have found universally, I have not encountered any faculty I can think of color who don't passionately care about other students of color, right? This idea of homophily, finding people who have the same lived experience as you or similar to yours. You want to make sure those people are having a good experience. You want to see more people like you in the academy. You understand your struggle getting to the academy was so intense. You want to make sure that you do what you can to help the person coming behind you, right? This idea of community uplift. But this is really amazing to me. I was talking to a professor and kind of known in the department as being kind of a hard ass, right? And one thing she talked about, this idea of the black bead, you can see the quote up there. But basically, a lot of faculty members seemingly are, good people, but don't really know how to challenge their students and support them at the same time. So it's a lot easier to give a student, a passing grade and tell them they're doing okay. But in her experience, she's like, look, I'm actually in spaces where people are talking about students' performance. Their names aren't coming up for postdoc opportunities or hiring opportunities. They're just being talked about. They're invisible because they're making these kinds of, these bees that are just like, you're just holding space. And the most powerful thing you can do, I think, as emerging scholars, to make sure you are getting the feedback you need. Because a lot of times people are like, I don't want to deal with people who are going to fuss at me. I'll be honest, I feel that way sometimes too. Turned some papers back to my freshman the other day. I'm like, oh my goodness, the B person's going to come to me and complain about the B they're getting. But I want them to do that because I want them to actually sit there and grapple with it. This is why you got the B. Let's talk about that. And let's talk about how you can improve the B. Not just like, I want a better grade, but how are you going to take the feedback I gave you and do something with it? And a lot of times people assume that, well, you just want a grade and you'll get it in my face, versus like, I wanted to have the critical engagement to know how my work can be better. I want to be in that space. I want to be challenged in that space, but I also don't want to be abused, right? There's a line between doing those two things, right? Giving people the right kind of input that's direct, that's challenging, but is not demeaning to them. And a lot of my colleagues can't do that. Like, they can give you feedback, but it's withering and it's meant to demean you, make you feel like a terrible person, versus like, this is an issue you need to work on. Here's how I suggest you make those changes, right? And I think it's a really important piece about some of the burdens that faculty have to deal with, because sometimes they are the truth tellers in the institution. I know you're getting B's in this class, but it's C-level work, that kind of thing. One of the pieces I wanted to talk about in this particular piece, I'm looking at Frank Tuitt's work about caring for the souls of black folks, right? Institutions, by their definition, PWIs, are exclusionary for black and brown folks often, right? And also the issue that there's not structural sort of implements to make sure that care of people is really at the forefront, right? In my own work, I've talked to faculty about the work they've done with students about domestic violence issues, funding issues for students who are not their students, right? You might say, well, that's the job of the faculty. It's not the job of a faculty member to work with a student in another department to help them get funding because their advisor is ghost. They're not around to be consulted with. A piece I just did with Veronica Jones at a PWI, somewhere in the South. Student activists. And these students are, organizing protests, letter writing campaigns. They're very organizationally savvy. They're not just, sitting with a picket sign. They do multiple things. But they're all doing this with double majors and LSAT prep, all these different things that are going on. And it goes back to some work I did back when I was in graduate school. I'll never forget this. We went to Yale, and we went to Yale to visit with the Asian American Student Center. We got there about 7 o'clock in the night. And it was 7 o'clock. 7:30, 7:45, students aren't there. We just drove all the way from Cambridge. It's kind of late. We're like, what's going on? Students come in and they're like bedraggled and they're exhausted. Well, tomorrow's Diwali, so we're doing our preparation for that, and we're doing all this stuff for this. And I realized, I'm getting data and I'm trying to find these students' experiences, but I'm taxing them by having them come out to this meeting after hours and tell me about their experiences about being taxed. And a student said something really powerful to me, and she said, it's like we're adjunct faculty in the College of Diversity and we don't get paid. How many institutions put in the view book, look at our Holy celebration, it's so great, right? How much is that supported by the institution, and how much is that is just simply saying, students go do it, here's some cash, that helps, but that's what you get, and then go do the work, we'll put a picture in the view book, we're good, right? We have addressed the issues of structural inequities by having you do the work. And by the way, you have a test tomorrow, so prepare for that. This idea about John Henryism, I think, is really important, and Ebony McGee here talks about weathering. What is the psychic toll and physical toll on students when that work's being done all the time? I have to tell students sometimes, you do not have to intercede on every issue of social injustice. It's going to kill you. It's okay to be in class and hear something that's problematic and kind of catalog it. Okay, that's something that was said, that's a problem, but not actually invest yourself in every issue, because guess what? You are going to burn out really quickly, right? But also, as staff members, as faculty members, as graduate students, we're off on the same road. Matthew and I had this conversation, we're traveling the same road. And a lot of times, students think, I'm 18, I'm 19, I'm 20, you don't understand what's going on. We got social media now. And I'm like, I'm not that old. We had similar issues ourselves. And in fact, we're dealing with the same kinds of things, but we don't often talk to each other about the same struggles we're having. Developmentally, I'm in a different place, so maybe I have a different strategy about dealing with this. Or, I'm equally perplexed by this issue. Let's walk through that together. That's a really critical part of the experience, and I always wonder, what are we doing to model for students what's the right thing to do? I know so many excellent scholars of color who I would not say to students, be like that person, because that person is really, really emotionally in a frail place, because they have so much they're doing and they don't have time for themselves, right? Because they decide they're going to be best at everything they do. And that means I'm going to counsel every student who has challenges. I'm going to write every grant opportunity I see if possible. I'm going to do all those different things, right? I don't know if we're always doing a great job of being good role models in that regard. So, what are the real costs of public scholarship? So, Saida Grundy, Saidi and I are both Career Enhancement Fellows. She's much younger than me, but nevertheless, we have the same fellowship. And this summer we were talking, and you might have heard her story. She got hired at Boston University. She had tweeted something about, why are we not talking about the responsibility of white men in white supremacy? It's pretty innocuous stuff, but guess who got hold of it? The National Review got hold of it. And all of a sudden, it becomes an issue, and her actual employment comes into question. There are these pressure groups that are saying, you need to fire this woman before she even gets the job. That's how she started her career, dealing with that. Dr. Durden over there showed up on Fox News and made some points on the Tucker Carlson show and lost her job. Unlike Saida and Tommy and myself, Dr. Durden is adjunct faculty member. And those folks work at will. So she went on the what's his name? Tucker Carlson show, and they didn't like what she said, and she's gone. Tommy Curry, Texas A&M, philosopher, was sort of talking about white supremacy and had words taken out of context, and basically they said, well, this guy's trying to get white people killed, right? Never mind the fact that black people are actually getting killed in the state of Texas by white supremacists, but his very articulation of the sort of question about white power was twisted into some conversation about him being a person advocating for the death of white people. I know Tommy, he's not that kind of person. That's not what he said. Again, it's selective quoting from his work, and he dealt with that. You can't see this picture very well, but that's a picture from a screenshot from campusreform.org. You've hit the big time when you get chased by these folks. So we wrote a piece I talked about earlier. The piece I talked about earlier was about diversity fatigue, and basically the idea that when you do diversity education, you're not just simply talking about fire codes. You're talking about things that are personal and impact your life in a very personal way. And how institutions don't really think about that, they just send you out there to do it. Anybody do diversity education in this space? Okay, so, because I'll tell you, because they'll say, this department had something bad happen, go educate them, right? And you're like, okay, are they receptive to this idea? Do they want to be in this space? And I can always tell you, I'm in a space and there's something like this. You know, I don't want to be here. I've heard this a million times before. And you know, that's painful. Or you're talking about gender identity. And you know, you talk about non-binary status and people are like, what is that all about? And perhaps you are a non-binary person, right? Those kinds of things, right? And so I remember Ryan Miller is one of my grad students. He's now a professor at UNC Charlotte. Ryan says to me, I got a call from campusreform.org. Do I respond to it? I'm like, no, do not respond to it. So they went ahead and did it, and of course the scare quotes are everywhere, and the picture of this very scared-looking woman there, of course, is there. And it was a fairly minor thing. It was popped on their website for a day. But 2 days later, my colleague Veronica Jones, who's at University of North Texas, says, you know, I got this email and I'm really freaked out about it. It was from a faculty member in the psychology department who took issue with the word trauma. So we use trauma in the academic sense. So trauma, not necessarily talking about, you know, physical trauma, but emotional trauma. And this individual said, I was in the Army, you don't know anything about trauma, you libs or blah, blah, blah. This is from a faculty colleague. And so I said, you know, and she's brand new in the faculty. And I'm like, okay, well, my recommendation to you is to go talk to your department head. Talk to your department head and see what that goes from there. And luckily she did that, and the department head was wonderful. They dealt with the situation in some way. But this is what happens when you put yourself out there and your work out there. And I know we offer in spaces where I talk very freely about things like white supremacy and white privilege. Outside of the space, some people aren't ready to hear that. And they think it means that you're talking about white people individually. And I'm like, you know, you might be a white supremacist. That may be true. But I'm talking about a system. And nobody in this space, I often say when I'm talking to groups, created white supremacy. But a lot of y'all benefit from it, right? I say that as well. But just so people can get past that defensive stance and saying, well, you just said something, I can't hear anything you're saying. And I've heard people say, well, we need other words to use this. I'm like, no, let's use the words we actually use. Like, you know, we have this sort of cultural fear about using terms like racism or white supremacy when that's what it actually is, right? Let's call it what it is and stop using these sort of soft shell words. My favorite thing to do is look at all these politicians dance around racism. Was that person doing something that was racist? I don't want to talk about that. It was bad. I don't agree with it, right? They won't say, yeah, that was racist, right? And that person is not necessarily the scourge of the earth, but they said something racist, and that's a problem, right? But especially for emerging scholars, I always tell them to be thinking about how do you deal with these things, and who's your network, who do you go to when these things go on? Because it will happen. If you're doing critical work, at some point, this will happen to you, maybe not on the same scale, but it will happen when somebody says, I don't think you are credible because you said something that bothers me, right? This idea of symbolism. One of my favorite pieces is a piece by Margolis and Romero, and the piece I wrote, obviously, with Victor Saenz, was this idea that the invisibility of the codes of the academy. There's no profession that has more veiled codes than this one, right? I remember, and Matthew will appreciate this, I remember as a graduate student in the early days when they had Flush with Cash before they opened up the Alston development, we actually had wine and cheese Fridays, right? So you go to the library and you get wine and cheese and you sip on the wine and you talk to people. I thought, it's free wine. All right, you know, this is cool. And somebody would kind of tell me, like, that's not really the point, Rich. The point is to talk to people. I don't want to talk to these people. I don't know what these people are about. Like, no, that's part of the whole thing. Nobody told me that. I was like, this is a place I get free wine. This is good. And I didn't realize I'm supposed to talk to the person who works in information technology and the person who works in ed psych and get to know them a little bit and learn these codes of the academy and get them to think I'm a good person, that kind of thing. And I often find myself talking to scholars. Lisa Bass, who's a colleague of mine, and she used to be at the University of Vermont, I don't know where she is right now. But Lisa and I talked about having a boot camp for young scholars of color, because we're like, look, stuff is happening to people and they don't even know. I don't try to freak my students out by saying this, but I tell them, you are being assessed constantly in this space. And that shouldn't freak you out, but you should be aware. Case in point, I was talking to a senior scholar one time, fireside chat at AERA, and kind of was ranting about, well, these students aren't taking stuff seriously. It's one of those kinds of conversations. So of course, I'm a junior faculty member. I'm like, let's engage with that a little bit. And he's like, somebody came to my office wearing basketball, shorts, blah, blah, blah. And I said to myself, he's probably thinking, I see community with you. It'd be great to meet with this person. You're thinking this person's not respecting you. That's a big leap, right? But nevertheless, there's a communication gap, and I have to tell students, like, look, that first time, err on the side of doing it overly. Go dress really nicely. Get to know them, go see them casually next time. But the first time, you are being assessed. That happens a lot. And so I know for me, how do you combat those kinds of experiences? I think a lot about the restorative spaces, resistance spaces, or home places, as Bell Hooks talks about. Something that Matthew knows a lot about is the Alumni of Color Conference at Harvard. As a new grad student, I got involved in the movement to start that conference. And we've decided we're tired of being told that folks who look like us, who do not have positions at Stanford and Yale, are not credible scholars. We know people doing great work, but they're working in Harlem. They're working in Mattapan. They're doing different things. We created a space to honor that work. We also created a space to memorialize the fact that there have been a steady stream of folks of color coming to the institution that never felt connected to it. And that relates to the story about Lisa Delpit. Y'all know Lisa Delpit's work, Math is for White People, the work she's been doing in that certain area. Lisa had never come back to the School of Education after she graduated. Became a luminary, became a star, never came back. Our members of our committee called over there and said, Lisa, we're starting a conference, and I know you haven't been back. Lisa said, I'll be there, because y'all asked me, I'll be there. And the moment we had it, it was powerful. We were in the basement of the library, crying. We used to overcome. We were just doing all that stuff, because it's like, wow. It just took us coming to you and asking you directly, the students saying, we want you back, right? I mentioned earlier the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation, the Career Enhancement Fellowship. I had that fellowship in 2011. I go to that retreat every year. For the last 8 years, I've been going to this retreat. And I sit and talk to scholars of color in their third year and the tenure track, and we just get real. We talk about, we cry, we share community, we talk about the struggles we're going through, we talk about how we need to take care of ourselves. My friend Butch Ware, who's now at the University of California, Santa Barbara, talks about you need to preserve yourself, because there's he uses the pencil analogy. He says, if your lead is broken, you're not going to write well, right? Some of us are broken pencils. Like, we are literally walking around as broken people because we're attending to everything in the world but ourselves. And that's a bad thing. Rich Milner, got to talk about Rich. Rich, the story I'll share with you is a really short one, but when I was in grad school, I know you've been told this by your professors, you should actually email or call people you read, right? Just tell them that their work is impactful. I did it. I emailed Rich Milner, this professor at Vanderbilt, and I got an email back like 20 minutes later, and it was like an email that actually had things in it besides thanks. He was like, I'm so excited you're reading my work. How's it impacting what you're thinking about? I call him up, and I'm a brand new doctoral student. I'm talking to this professor at Vanderbilt, and we're just vibing. He's just like, this is great. What else are you working on? Since that day, Rich and I have been sort of kindred souls in the academy. He knew me when I was in grad school, and I can't be more thrilled. I want to put him out there and have you all go into him and bother his office. But there are people like that in the academy. I'm just so impressed that there are. Michelle Foster, Sylvia Hurtado, Patricia Hill Collins, Sophia Vinas. These are people I think about who are actually actively resisting. They are senior people, they are names, but they care about people. And there's so many more I could list, but I just thought it's important to know that you need to connect to those folks in the academy who are doing this work. It's critically important. So, moving forward, what do we know about the experience today compared to 1984? I think about the fact that, scholars have more to do than they had in the 80s. And I want to make it very clear. The work in the 1980s was groundbreaking. It was pivotal. They were the first ones in their departments. They were bringing forth new areas of scholarship. The folks who do the work now are doing this, plus the mentoring, plus the other stuff, plus advancing the field. So I think there's so much more to be doing, and the resources haven't changed that much, right? We haven't perfected the 24-hour day. We only have 24 hours. We don't have 24 and a half. We don't have 25. That hasn't changed, right? This idea of the normalization of diversity rhetoric. Every campus has a diversity committee, diversity whatever, right? And now it means that all the folks who are underrepresented are involved in that process. And also this idea that we just say we have diversity committees, we have a work group, but what's happening structurally to change the institution? That's harder work. And I find there's a lot of resistance to that kind of work, lots of it. So what's the call to action? And I want us to engage in a conversation about this because I don't think I have all the answers, but some of the things I think about are, how do we challenge institutional structural norms? My immediate response to anything we talk about now is, what are we doing structurally to change this? Like, okay, these things are happening at this college or in this campus. Structurally, how are we changing things? Crickets, right? I don't know, we'll talk about that. This idea that the mentoring work that faculty of color do needs to be distributed. I tell students the same thing. I say, look, don't come just looking for people who look like you to mentor you. My experience through the academy has been shaped by a lot of great scholars who do not look like me. Black women have shaped my career in amazing ways. White women have shaped my career in amazing ways. And if I was saying I can just find people who fit my ethnic and racial identity and gender identity, then I can't talk to anybody else, I'd be really limited, right? It's a two-way thing. Also, I talk to white faculty all the time, like, listen, you have an interest with a student, you're from the same community, you have similar ways of seeing the world, you can do this work too. And of course, there might be times where you realize, okay, I'm mentoring a student who has a population identity that's not mine. I need some help. That's good. But you don't just walk away and say, you should do this because you fit this category, right? Adequate and fair compensation. And I don't just mean financial compensation, but that's good. We'll start with that. But a lot of times it's just simply recognizing that the work you do is valuable and it's important. I've talked to many of my colleagues in senior levels and like, look, can we provide a fellowship? Can we provide a title? Can we provide a colloquia? Something we can do to support people doing this kind of work. And a lot of times they're like, we don't have that much. I'm like, I'm not saying it has to be a whole lot of money, and that's just me talking, I know, but I'm like, sometimes it's simply recognizing this work is important and doing something about it, right? And really think about the academy. So we are so obsessed with being research productive. We're so obsessed with this, 5-6 year window about tenure promotion. It really fits the sort of trope of somebody who is in a situation where they're not doing anything but doing that kind of work, right? I did a study many years ago about faculty fathers, and one of the men used the term monastic to describe academic lives. And if you have a monastic lifestyle, which is supported by somebody like a partner who can do the work of maintaining a household or raising children and so on and so forth, guess what? That might work for you. A lot of us aren't doing that. A lot of us are doing things like taking care of elders and young people, right? So if that's how the academy looks, why is these standards not changed to sort of address that? Why are we so afraid to say, you know what, we may need to extend the period for some people. So we have stoppages, right? I took a stoppage. I was the first man in my college to take a stoppage because people were like, well, it's there, but frankly, I talked to some people in the STEM fields and they were like, look, if people know I took a stoppage, that doesn't look good for me. Because they're going to tell me that this guy over here got cancer, went through a divorce, got 5 grants last year. What are you doing, right? That's problematic. We need to start thinking about how that's not a good and healthy way to sort of persevere through the academy. So I'll stop there and give you a chance to get involved with the conversation. I know I said a lot of stuff, probably said it way too fast. That's from being from West Texas. It's a joke. I am the only West Texan in the world who talks fast. But nevertheless, I'd love to talk to you more about this. So if there's anything in the presentation that you have questions about, or you want to share some experiences, I'd love to hear those. Thank you so much. Time to hydrate.
I guess I'll moderate questions. All right, I'll moderate questions.
Look at that, I got a moderator.
You'll not necessarily like that. Carolyn.
Eric, thanks for a
Hey.
presentation. So you could think about this question from your own institution or in general from your studies, but I think about your slide showing kind of the pipeline up to full professor.
Mm-hmm.
And then you think about who sits on the committees in universities that ultimately decide
Yep.
people's promotions. And I feel, having served now at all levels, I feel like we're a long way from getting to where we need to be, in part because and the same, also the letter writers who are drawn on, right? So this whole process is kind of set up this way. I feel impatient. I'd like to see this shake up sooner, but I don't know if you have any wisdom from your thoughts about, is that going to happen sooner or later? I mean, I feel like it would have to be kind of a earth-shattering type of change, right?
Right.
So we decide we're not going to rely so much on external letters. We're going to look at, like you said, other ways of documenting influence and impact in your field and on thinking. So I'm just curious about your thoughts on this.
Yeah. Now I'm on the level, I sit in the committees as well for at least junior folks, and I certainly have those same kinds of reservations, especially when I hear things like this person who can speak to this person's quality of work is not at a peer institution. And that idea in itself is ridiculous because people make all kinds of choices about where they work, besides the fact that it's not the biggest name in the field. I was relating a story earlier about a colleague who is at an institution that's not very prestigious because her partner is nearby, and that's why she's there, and she's doing great work, but that's gonna sort of hamstring her going forward because people are gonna say, well, you're not doing critical, important work, and in fact, she is. I don't know how we get people to stop thinking that way because I find it really problematic because there's this and my provost made this point recently, you know, first-gen students, students who are low SES, students who are not part of sort of the traditional mainstream of higher education are often not in those spaces. So if you want to move the needle, you've got to think differently about this. And also, I just think we have a real bizarre sort of way of treating people after we hire them. We do all this work to hire people, and we kind of step away and see what happens, right? You kind of turn the key on the back of the toy, and you walk away and just watch it. And you don't ever say, we're responsible for what happens. It's a collaborative responsibility. So somebody drops the ball and does nothing, that's on them. That never happens, though. It's usually a person is struggling and trying to get through, and we don't do a whole lot to help that person. When the probationary period gets over with, we're like, okay, well, they didn't do X, Y, and Z. Instead of asking, what did we not do right? Where did we fail? And I think it's the part people don't want to talk about. People don't want to talk about systemic and sort of departmental failures in supporting students, faculty. I'm a big proponent of saying that the time seems to be kind of arbitrary. Can we not think more creatively about how time is used as scholars? I'm telling all of my students who finish, when you go into the market, negotiate for time. Like honestly, I got good money, I got that figured out really well, I got the parking permit and blah, blah, blah. But I wish I had thought critically about time. Because the burden of starting everything up for the first time, teaching classes, getting an institutional space, and then you have to do all the other things you're supposed to be doing. You need time for that. And I can tell you, I always will credit Woodrow Wilson. That sounds weird for me to say that. The Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation and the Mellon Mays Network for giving me the space to actually have a year away from teaching. I love teaching. Teaching is immersive. It takes up all of my time. A year away from teaching gave me time to write, to correct the R&Rs, get things out there. You look at my CV, 2011, I was like Superman, 7 articles out. I'm like, no, I had time to actually do stuff. And it's amazing how you don't get that. And I don't know why we're so obsessed with this 6 or 7 year thing. And also why we're so cowardly when it comes to saying we'll do it differently here. We're a leader, we do things differently here. We talk all this stuff about being a prestigious institution, blah, blah, but we always fall in line with everybody else. We never say, we're doing it different here. We're drawing a line in the sand. We're going to promote somebody who does not have these traditional metrics, but they have other things. Easy for me to say, I don't make those decisions at this point, but just wait. Great question, thank you.
Oh, I'll call me.
Imagine that. Imagine that.
I did though. No one else had their hand up.
Gotta move fast.
Okay, so this sounds great, but I see a variety of roadblocks in actually moving from the way we think about faculty productivity
even beginning from the graduate student perspective, all the way through the full professor perspective, this is practically an issue of inertia. So this is partly a question of agency and partly a question of collaboration. I haven't quite figured out where this falls. On whom is the burden to advocate for different metrics and for different compensation, be it financial, be it time, be it accounting for the variety of ways that people are contributing to the academic community? Is it on the graduate student? Is it on the person coming into the university from the job market? Is it on the assistant professor? I'm going to say no on that. Is it on the people who are more senior colleagues? Is it on the leadership of the institution? There's so many people at so many different levels, and there's so much inertia, and the more senior you get, the more likely you are to have benefited from the current system.
Right.
So,
That's what I like, Matthew. You always have the easy questions for me. So I think one thing I tell folks who are doing things that are sort of different, or things that are sort of phrased or shaped in a different way, is like, first of all, know the currency of the academy. So if you're a community-based scholar and you're in the community a lot, write about that. Write about the experience of being in the community, right? Because it's not always simply, I'm going to be able to write an article about my narrow research area. So I was talking to a scholar who does engineering research, and I wrote a piece about the engineering project he runs. You could have done that, because I'm like, you have something great happening here that doesn't necessarily impact, energy policy, but you're doing something about community engagement, which is really important. And Brent and I talked about it yesterday. We talked about that experience. The other thing is, like, you have to be able to quantify and explain the value of what you're doing. So a lot of times people are like, and the qualitative guys talk about quantifying things. Yes, I'm doing it. But for instance, if you're on social media and you're having a conversation and it's getting retweeted, you've got to explain to people this is impact, right? So look at my retweet count, and they don't know what that means, but you have to start thinking about, how do I measure? Because we're obsessed with measuring things, right? But also, one thing that really surprised me, I started writing op-eds like fanatically, and for some reason it coincides with November 2016. I started writing a lot of op-eds. Every time I write an op-ed, I get some heat from people. The trolls come out and start saying stuff. Where'd you get your doctorate at? Is it a real doctorate? Blah, blah, blah. And you have to have asbestos hide. You have to kind of just like, I said what I said, it's pour by data, I put it out there in the world. I was talking to my associate dean. She said, the op-ed stuff is going great. I'm like, really? I didn't know that was like scholarly. And she's like, our institution is always thinking about, how do we impact public opinion and public policy? You're getting stuff into spaces that aren't journals. And I was like, wow, you're saying that. I'm like, this is impressive, and we'll see what happens, right? Talk to me in 2019. But it was refreshing to hear that at least there's some understanding that there's other methods and other ways of pushing our work out besides the traditional peer-reviewed article, university press sort of options. At the same time, Matthew, I think you're right. We need to really challenge those people who have positions of power to start thinking about, the world is changing and we have different ways of communicating and getting our work out there. Can we at least engage in conversations about that? Can we at least get to a point, and there's people out there doing work in this area about what's the impact of social media. I can tell you educational researchers are really behind on that. We are not a technically literate field, unfortunately, and that's problematic because it means that there's constantly conversations happening that we're not part of. And we're in the Twitter age, right? We literally have public policy by Twitter. We better get involved in that same process. So it's a shared responsibility, but I think I would definitely tell folks, if you're doing something that's different, make sure you have somebody and something that supports what you're doing. So find that scholar who's senior, who's doing that kind of work, who can say, yes, this is what we need to see more of. And make sure you're writing about the things that you are doing that are different. I'm always amazed when I talk to people who are scholars doing really interesting sort of work, boundary spanning kind of work, and they don't ever talk about the actual process of doing that. Case in point, I have a white woman student who's graduated many years ago, but when she graduated, she was doing work on first-gen students of color. And I'm like, you need to talk about the experience of being a credible person to students of color. Because you had to do some work to make that happen. Because you had to get access to a community, you had to maintain that access and credibility. And then part of that comes because you are a white woman, perhaps, yes, but also you encounter some challenges. Another student I had, another white woman, was trying to do work on graduate students and actually was told straight up by faculty of color, I'm not going to help you. And I was like, you need to sort of process what that means. And what does it mean to have credibility in some spaces? And are you in fact somehow in a space where you're actually taking the heat for the irresponsibility of other scholars, right? Because I know the student, she's woke, but you know, people are like, I can't trust you on this. I don't know what you're going to do with these students. I don't think this is a good idea. I'm sorry. And it's like, wow, you know. But from the professor's perspective, I told her this, I was like, look, that's not actually an illogical thing to say. And it sucks for you, but I actually understand why she would say this. I don't know if I asked your question.
You did.
I answered other questions as well.
I answered additional questions, so I don't have to ask them.
I do that.
There was
Marissa?
one sort of thing that I also heard in that question that I was wondering if you could talk about is the sense of, to be successful in this world, you have to come to believe in the way that the institution works, or at least pretend that you believe in the way the institution works. I'm wondering if you see any evidence, or if you can talk about that process for success for scholars of color.
I think a lot about sort of code switching, right? Because I think that's what we do as marginalized scholars. We have to find ways to sort of speak in the language that people give us credibility. So, you know, this group, I kind of feel a vibe with this group. I've met with a lot of you, so I feel like, y'all cool, we can be a little different. I would be slightly different presenting this work to some other communities, right? And that's part of what we do as scholars. I think we have to be adept and nimble. I see people who do the same thing wherever they go, and I'm like, how odd is that? You know, like to sort of talk to a group of fourth graders like you're lecturing a class of freshmen and vice versa. So I think there is this realization, and it's my perspective, and then some people would say, you know, this is a neoliberal sort of accommodation kind of space. But I think we have to acknowledge the fact that this is the most entrenched institution there is. You know, the oldest business in this country, Harvard University Corporation, right, 1636. Higher education is old, and it's resistant to change. And I think we have to think about changing from within and without. So Deborah Myerson's work on tempered radicals, I strongly endorse, because I think it's how we start thinking about ourselves. How do we engage in radical acts in conventional roles? For some of us are going to go to places and be like, no, I'm going to burn this thing down. And I'm with you on that, right? We need to have folks doing things in multiple spaces, but I think it's understanding what the consequences are. So I always tell my students, you can do whatever you want, but here's what I see happening if you do it this way. You decide. And at some points in our career, it changes, right? At certain points, we can say things differently, do things differently. I would probably not present this research as a brand new professor, but I can do it now, and that's good. And we talked about the story of a senior scholar who kind of played the game, earned his credibility, and then flipped the script and said, I'm gonna start doing what I want to do. But most people get co-opted by the system. I think that's a really pertinent point. How do we keep our soul intact? And I think what you do is you stay connected to people coming through the academy. If you get to a space where all you're doing is conversing with people at your level, guess what? You forget all those struggles. You forget all those challenges. And I always find it fantastic that I'm inspired by my graduate students, because I hear what they talk about beyond the research stuff. Like, here's what I'm living like. And of course, this issue of debt is unreal. I have students in our program who have medical school type debt in the education program. You're not getting that back. What are we doing to students to create that kind of environment where that's okay? And my institution, like many institutions, we're retrenching, we have less money to go around. So all of a sudden, a lot of things that were managed by professionals is being managed by GAs and GRAs. So now they have like full-time jobs in 20-hour increments that 5 years ago was actually held by somebody who was a full-time employee. And, you know, one of my colleagues is really great about sort of pointing out the fact that this is exploitative. We need to do better by this. And the more you say those things, the more people start realizing like that is a problem. And we have these sort of cost of living analyses that are completely out of date. Like, I don't know how up to date your cost of living analyses are, but ours are not. Like, there's no way you can live where we live for this amount of money. And it's sort of constantly reminding people that these things are in change. So I think, for Marissa, I think it's something we have to constantly sort of be engaged in, and we have to make our own decisions. I don't think everybody here should be a template radical. I don't think everybody here should be an accommodationist. I don't think everybody here should be a complete radical. I think you have to find what fits for you, but you have to also be in a space where you're talking to people in those spaces as well. Like, I don't really like when people sort of say, well, this is a choice I made, and I'm good with this, and this is where I'm standing, and y'all all wrong. No, I need people outside doing crazy things that are like, wow, I wouldn't do that, but I'm glad you did, right?
Hi. Yes.
Hi.
I'm really interested in hearing more about your work at the Mayor's Task Force, specifically for someone like myself who's studying development action, and especially interested in anti-racism work inside and outside of higher education. And like hearing about like your successes on the task force, but also some of your shortcomings.
Yeah, I could write a book about that. Yeah. Good friend of mine is the president of our local HBCU called me. She called campus looking for Rich. And I'm like, when you start calling people in offices and they're like, where are you? Somebody is calling you, you need to call them back. So I called her back. She's like, I need a favor. So of course I said I would do it. And I was working with a colleague of mine who works with the Educational Foundation in town. And so, first of all, most of the people who were on the committee with us were practitioners, a lot of school leaders in the Austin School District. And it was interesting because I worked with charter schools. So that was an interesting sort of, well, wait a minute, get back, Many of whom I actually had taught in my own programs. The other thing I thought was interesting is the common language issue. So we're convened to talk about institutional racism and structural inequity. The word race did not come up until like the second meeting we had. Because we were all talking about, oh, well, kids need opportunities and blah, blah, and we were just kind of dancing around it. So what we ended up doing is Glenn Singleton, who does Courageous Conversations, came and did a workshop for us and gave people tools about talking about inequity. And so finally we had a discussion about race. And of course, my colleagues who were super critical were just like, this is pointless. And that's the other thing that was a challenge, is that people felt you're not moving the needle fast enough. And I had to, it was like, proximal zones of development, like Vygotsky, right? We had to figure out, some of y'all just starting stuff for the first time. Some of y'all could lead these workshops. We're on the same committee. How do we calibrate? And one of the most meaningful experiences I had was when we did for South by Southwest EDU, we did a panel with the mayor. And I kind of called the mayor out because I'm like, look, you asked us to do something in like 6 months. That's impossible to do. But I'm also glad you gave us that pressure because it made people have to come together and at least force issues. Some people said, I'm not doing this kind of work. And frankly, I'm not really as engaged as I used to be on the work right now because I'm doing other things, but I'm aware of what's happening. I think it's going really well. But it definitely was an interesting sort of humbling experience because, I don't get to walk around as Dr. Reddick in those spaces. Or I walk around as Dr. Reddick, but it's not critically interrogated. I'm like, let's break that apart. And me being a kid who grew up in this part of the city, I can talk about inequity from a very personal experience, right? And that was luckily gave me some credibility, but we're not always going to be in spaces like that. We're going to learn to talk to different constituencies. People in real estate who don't understand anything about education, we're like, what are you talking about? That doesn't really happen. Here's the data, yes it does. That was definitely an eye-opening thing, but I think anything that brings people together to talk about these issues is a critically important thing we need to be doing. And I will credit the mayor for at least having the imagination, the daring to do it, because it could have gone very badly. And in fact, there were some meetings I was like, oh man, that was not what we wanted to see happen. And those folks got mired down in this issue, we couldn't get past it. But that's what it's like working in a community setting. You don't get to set an agenda and follow through with it. It's like, we're gonna be doing this. The day that ICE had a crackdown in Austin, we're meeting in a school. I have school leaders in there who are literally in tears. Like, I saw 4 of my students get arrested today. That kind of stuff, you put the agenda away and say, let's talk about that. And let's talk about how we can build. And what I think has really been important about that is now I have a network of folks that I didn't have before. And we don't talk just about institutional racism issues. We talk about socioeconomic issues. We talk about all kinds of things that we didn't before. And I think the act of bringing people together from different sort of educational vantage points was was a good thing to do. I'm still processing it in some ways, actually. So, thank you for that question. I'm going to think about that on the plane back home now. Joanne. Oh, I'm sorry. You're moderating. Sorry, Matthew. Just taking over.
You've talked to lots of scholars of color and some students of color through your work, and I'm just wondering, on the flip side, I'm thinking about kind of success strategies or things you've heard that really are pivotal in making a difference for students and faculty in succeeding in in the academy. I know you mentioned finding affiliates like you, but are there other things that you've heard in your interviewing people that seem to be helpful?
Yeah. Joanne, I think the one thing that I have found is building trust and finding those institutional agents who will translate for you what things mean. I'm at University of Texas, and people will say something to you. It does not mean what they said. They're like, oh, that was a good, I'm glad you did that particular thing. No, it wasn't. It was actually a terrible thing you did. You need somebody to be able to tell you what that means, right? And I'm often reminded of a situation. In my dissertation, I talked to both white faculty mentors of black students and black faculty mentors of black students. My advisor wanted me to do comparative work. I was mad at her for days. And now I've published more about the cross-racial piece because an example of this, there are very sort of impactful things that individuals did that resonated big time. So one professor, at a time when Harvard was getting its first sort of influx of black students on a large scale, one of the faculty members said, you know what, grade inflation is a problem, I'm gonna write an op-ed about it, and did. And this professor said, where's the data on this? Like, where are you getting this from? And he hemmed and hawed, he had no data, just a sense he had. And he says, well, this is just bad science. So he wrote an op-ed refuting it. What he found out was that students cut that out and said, look, there's somebody in this space who actually cares about us, right? And he said he didn't realize that for years until he realized he was becoming known. Like people would just show up in his office. He's like, I don't teach you, I don't know why you're here, but can I help you? And he didn't realize students had a network and they would come and tell each other, like, look, this person is down for us. This person is, because a lot of people were silent. A lot of people disagreed with what happened, but only he wrote the op-ed, right? So action matters. Another time there was a white woman faculty member who was invited to an AKA Meet the Faculty event, and she was the only non-black faculty member who showed up.
What's AKA?
Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, historically black sorority. And from that moment, people were like, oh, okay, she came out. What's up with that? That's really cool. So I think those moments of courage of saying, let me put myself in a space that maybe is different. Let me model for students or experience at least what they are experiencing. One of my favorite stories about that is I interviewed a gentleman who was Swedish by birth, but grew up in Germany, and that was a cultural thing he grew up with. Scholar in the United States, identified by black students as a mentor, and I asked him about his experience, and he actually kind of flipped, he's like, I don't really know when you talk about this black-white thing. Why is everybody obsessed with that? I'm like, what? He went there. But then he told me a story about going to a party with a friend of his, and the friend said, my friends are gonna be there, it'll be great. He goes there, he's the only white person in the party. And he was like, the party was great, food was great, music was great, had a good time, but I did notice I was the only white person there. And I said, did that give you a sense of empathy? He's like, yeah. He said, it didn't feel bad, but it felt different. And I knew I felt different. So now I know when I have 2 black students in a classroom of 35, they probably feel different too. It might not be a bad feeling, but they definitely feel hyper visible. I'm like, yes. So I think that's a really key thing to do is that we have to model for students what we think is important. And we have to also challenge our allies. If you're an ally, you have to be prepared to be challenged. I'm a feminist, I'm an ally to queer folks, and I've often been told, like, you need to start doing more of this. I'm like, okay, that's fair. I mean, I'm not always aware of the things that I bring as my privileged spaces that I should be doing things. It's helpful to have people sort of remind you of that, but also not to sort of default and say, well, you please tell me what to do next, but actually take visionary, bold steps ourselves. Once again, I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I think I said some stuff. Yes?
So I was just thinking about, you were using the term
And I was thinking about a piece by Delta I read a few years ago when I was teaching, where she speaks about basically Black teachers had a certain approach to teaching, and based on their experience of being Black and working in that community, that their white peers would then say, would question and say, where's the evidence?
Right.
And so I can see that looking in the academy, you know, being one of few, it's like this experience of being both hyper visible and invisible at the same time.
Yep.
When you bring your kind of experiences to the forefront,
Mhm.
it could be almost categorized as that's just personal angst.
Right.
So thinking about your presentation and thinking back to that article, I noticed there weren't any equations, you know, it wasn't a quantitative perspective. How have folks kind of used that approach to question your credibility? And then how can folks who want to bring up these issues be supported when those questions of credibility arise?
Right. So, great question, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I do not walk in front of people and just do this and like, oh, right, we're on board. It's a lot, well, how do you know that? That's anecdotal, right? The diminishing of qualitative research sort of methods is always something I deal with. But people want to get data drunk as well. Like, I often go to people and say, we've got an issue with, you know, faculty diversity issues. Well, let's study. There's 30 years of research already out there that makes this case quite evident. I can talk to anybody in my department and at my university and say, are we doing a good job of faculty diversity? And the answer is never like, yeah. It's usually like, you know. So I think sometimes it's challenging people to think about the fact that a lot of work has been done already. And guess what? PWIs kind of have the same storyline. There are some, you know, islands and pockets of success, to use that term, but I think sometimes it's like people don't understand there's actually a literature on this. Like, I'm often amazed when I talk about cultural taxation. I always cite Padilla. People are like, well, Rich has this term. I'm like, it's not my term. I do a lot of work in this area, but it's been around for a while, right? These concepts, and of course, we call in other folks like Geneva Gay, who's been doing similar kinds of work. I think it's also challenging people with just straight up raw data. So let's go to IPEDS, let's go to NCS database and look at faculty diversity numbers. There's your evidence, right? I can quantify these problems very easily. And usually what I've told people is like, it gives us an idea what's happening. It doesn't tell us what lived experiences are. Something as complex as campus climate experiences or decision to stay or leave or take a position, you've got to delve into that in a very deep level. And it's things like, I had experience with a realtor that really turned me off. You know, can you survey for that? I suppose you can, but I think when I sit down and talk to the experience, and in fact, my institution now does exit interviews for faculty if they opt to do that. And those are so rich because people will walk you through, it wasn't just one thing. It was these 7 or 8 things that happened in sequence that told me a picture about y'all. And I think that's something that people don't want to hear about. We did a study on campus climate, and I was charged with analyzing the qualitative data. The quantitative data told us what we already knew. Women and people of color and queer folks have a less satisfying experience at the university. The qualitative data told us why. Like, childcare is a mess here, you know, transportation is a problem here. Like, all those kinds of things came out from that data. So I'm always going to uphold and support my colleagues who do the quantitative research, but I think for these experiences, something as unique as how do I interface with this institution needs to be explored in a qualitative manner. And most of my quantitatively minded colleagues agree with me. They're like, yeah, I get it. Like, we see a pattern here, but we don't know exactly what's happening. And oftentimes they're like, well, how do we do that? I'm like, focus groups. I'm like, what is that? You know, who trained you? You know, you know, I know you took the advanced stats class, but did you take an intro qual class? Maybe you should have. Anyway, so yeah, it's definitely something we have to think about. And talking to multiple constituencies, we can't just talk to people who think what we think and agree with us. In fact, when I have people who sort of like raise their eyebrow, I'm like, good, we can talk about why I have the understanding I have, and you can tell me what you experience as bad. And of course, I'll hear like, well, you know, I know these 5 people who've had these experiences. I'm like, okay, NCS, IPEDS, look at that. It's not translating to the larger group.
We have time for one more question.
Brent, yes.
So you talked a lot about, I think, institutional problems at the level of the organization, which I think are rampant, and you've identified this very well. But I think there's also broader structural problems about the academic enterprise of doing academic work. And so one of the things you said before you started taking questions I thought was really interesting about comparing people that take time off on the tenure clock relative to the person that can write 5 grants while having a child. Right? Like that is going to exist no matter how the university responds to it, because there's always a race to publish. Maybe more so in the natural sciences where there really are like the, but everywhere there's a first mover advantage. And it's somewhat of a zero-sum game in terms of how many available spots there are in the prestigious journals over the course of a year. So that is an inherently structural issue that goes well beyond any individual institution in the, the narrative of academic publishing and that process. So how do we deal with those issues?
Well, we go to Retraction Watch, and I'm a big fan of that blog. Do you guys know Retraction Watch? Retraction Watch is a blog that sort of categorizes and follows retractions in journals. And some of them are egregious, right? Like somebody completely faked their data, right? And you see this in the Chronicle every so often. There was that Dutch scholar who was a psychologist who was cranking out all these great papers, and somebody tried to collaborate with him, and like, where's your data? Oh, it's somewhere else, and there was no data. Anyway, it creates perverse incentives, and that's the whole point of Retraction Watch. Like, look what we're doing. Even the idea, like, you run an experiment, nothing significant. It's trash. Why is it trash? Like, let's walk through that process. And I was heartbroken when one of my favorite students, who was an Ed Psych student, and I get to sit on Ed Psych committees that are highly quantitative. I'm like, yeah, this is great. Like, and we actually argued for a qualitative pilot in the study. Nothing significant. None of the models work, and they're like kind of nodding their heads. What a shame! What a shame. I'm like, but there's some value in understanding what procedurally happened. Like, we just can't drop this. Like, it would be valuable someplace. There should be a journal of failed experiments, right? I would love to have that, because I think there's so much that we lose. When I start doing a study, I often talk to people in the field about what I'm doing, and sometimes they'll tell me, well, don't do it this way. That's so valuable. But that would never be there unless we actually had a repository of all the things that didn't work, or even sort of walking through that didn't work. And of course, we always end up saying in of our articles, well, next time around I'll do it this way, or don't do this, that kind of thing. So we don't really, it's kind of like when you teach kids to do math and you want them to show your work so you can see, okay, you messed up at this step. We don't do that as academics, and that's really not good. We're just showing the final product. And you might have seen this Princeton scholar recently who had a CV of failures. It's fantastic, right? I'm going to do one too, because it would be real long, Because again, all we do, and I always worry about how we frame these things. Even my introduction was wonderful. I've done a lot of things that have not worked well, right? Continue to do that. And I'm really obsessed now with this idea of humanizing my experiences, because I think if I have a modicum of success, I think it's important to explain that that didn't come one after the other. I had to learn a lot of hard lessons and things not going well or not going right to figure out that's how it's done. Matthew and I have the same advisor, and Angela, so I think we all had that experience. Yeah, so we all experienced failure on that level, but that's part of the thing. Like, how do we actually, as a community, think about embracing the fact that we don't always succeed? But again, I think you pointed this out. We don't really talk a lot about our lack of success or our failures, and that's problematic, because it means people who make mistakes and admit to them don't think this is a place they can exist in, and that's kind of what we do all the time. I tell my students I write and told I don't write well constantly, and you have to kind of pick up and keep moving. And a lot of times they think, no, everything you write is like gold, and like, no. I think I've had one journal article that was accepted the first time around, just one. Everything else is like, nah, or do it again, So those kinds of experiences I think are important. So I don't know, Brent, institutionally how we move it beyond that, but perhaps a journal of failures is what we need to start having. So, yes. I'll be the editor.
Join me in thanking Dr. Reddick.
Thank you. Can I say one thing before I finish? But I will tell you, for a first-gen kid out of Southeast Austin, this is a good dream come true. I love the fact that you made time to come out here and hear my rant. And I want you to know I really do appreciate it. I know everybody has things they could be doing, and I really appreciate you making it out here. So thank you. And thank you to Matthew and Joanne and everybody here who's made this such a wonderful visit. My goodness, it's been great. Thank you so much.
Lauren Seymour, she's here. She's our LPO rec who's been helping us out here.
Ah.